Let's get started. We have our final featured speaker, and then we'll have our roundtable discussion afterwards. We're very excited for our last speaker. Dr. Patricia Gowaty is a distinguished professor of ecology and evolutionary biology, currently at the University of California, Los Angeles, and she is also the distinguished research professor emerita at the University of Georgia. She's an evolutionary biologist who studies the adaptive significance and evolutionary dynamics of social behavior. She pioneered studies on extra-pair paternity and socially monogamous birds, naturalistic observations of female-female aggression, and the sex allocation in birds with helpers at the nest. Her most recent work is theoretical, and that includes a new hypothesis of fertility variation called the reproductive compensation hypothesis, and a new hypothesis of the origins of sex differences in reproductive decision-making. And responding to her shortly will be our own Dr. Donna Nofziger Plank. Please give a warm Pepperdine welcome to Dr. Gowaty.
I'm really happy to be here, and it's phenomenal to be included in a group of extraordinary scholars who have entertained me for the last day and a half. I hope I do half as well as they all did. I'm here to talk to you about sexual conflict. Darwin didn't want to talk about sexual conflict. Part of my talk will be the proof that he didn't want to talk about it. I will read you his words. I define sexual conflict operationally for you. It's a good working definition as what happens during interactions between males and females when the fitness interests of the sexes conflict. So it's a pretty broad definition. Now, we're really celebrating today and this week and up to next Monday or Tuesday, the first book not the first book, but on the origin of species by means of natural selection, which Darwin published in 1859. And I need everybody to be able to remember exactly what natural selection is. And I often give that test to incoming students, and I ask it of students who are doing their orals for their PhDs, and I'm often surprised by the inadequacy of the answers. It's really a very simple concept. So natural selection occurs within populations when individuals vary inheritable traits such that some individuals survive and reproduce better than others because of their trait variation in particular environments. Better not touch my computer, it moves. The book that I really want to focus on is the 1871 volume, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. Those of you who are Darwin scholars who have even ever picked up the book know that it was in two parts. And the first part really was devoted to what Ed talked about the other day, the descent of man. The second part, for a naturalist like me, is one of the richest sources for information about what real animals do in real populations. And in that section at least, Darwin was answering his critics. Darwin's critics had said that natural selection couldn't explain some of the extraordinary and bizarre traits, particularly of male birds, because these traits didn't enhance survival. In fact, they decreased the survival probabilities of their bears. The poster child for that concept were peacocks. So that's peacock feather. Peacock's ancestral home, where they live now in natural environments, is in India. One of their chief predators are tigers. And it's been repeatedly observed that male peacocks are more vulnerable to predation than female peacocks, and it's because their tails are so heavy they don't fly very easily. So they don't escape those predators as readily. And so Darwin's critics said, hey, natural selection doesn't account for these traits. I consider the second half of the 1871 volume as a response to Darwin's critics. He was very careful about what he talked about in the second half. This is sexual selection, or selection in relation to sex. And so it's sometimes even published as 2 volumes. So what Darwin talked about was a concept that he also talked about in On the Origin, but he talked at great length about it in the 1871 volume, and that's sexual selection. And that's the kind of selection that depends on the advantage which certain individuals have over other individuals of the same sex. He also said species, but the same sex and species. So this is about within sex variance and fitness, reproductive success in particular. So Darwin is accused of many things that he didn't do, even academically. And so one of the things that he didn't do was to give us a really good reason for why he more frequently observed choosy females and indiscriminate males. But he cataloged many examples of females who were very discriminating about the males with whom they'd mate. And he also gave many examples of males who were exceedingly ardent and indiscriminate about who they mated with. But I need to tell you that Darwin knew that females were sometimes pugnacious. He documented cases of female-female aggression. He knew that sometimes females were outrageously decorated and that males chose. And he was quite impressed with he even thought in humans, for example, that women's beauty could be accounted for by the choice of men. And he writes about that in this book, the 1871 volume. Now, I don't have any argument with Darwin on this point. In fact, I have very few arguments with Darwin. I have some arguments with my contemporaries who say that Darwin said things he didn't say. So in the 1970s, some people had a cursory reading of Darwin, and they wanted to explain why it is so common, so frequent, that females are choosy and males indiscriminate. And a couple of very important thinkers who are really very bright people, Bob Trivers and Jeff Parker, associated genes for choosy females and genes for indiscriminate males with what I'll broadly call the parental investment idea. And the idea here is very intuitive, and it was simply that those in those species where females contribute the most parental care or investment in offspring, that any particular copulation would be costly, and so females should be selection should favor those females who have genes for choosy behavior. And likewise, because copulations were so inexpensive for males, selection should favor those males who had genes for indiscriminate and ardent behavior. So these traits, and one of the reasons that Darwin was talking about male ardency or male competition and female choice was because both of these are mechanisms of sexual selection by which sexual selection would sort among males by their traits. So females preferred males with a trait like a big tail, or males with a small tail, then you could have the evolution of these extraordinary male traits. This is a violaceous trogon, and in the back is a female. She was out of focus, and I use this photograph to show you what this kind of generalization from Darwin's observations, the modern generalization from Darwin's old observations really obscures females. And I've had a beef with that with my colleagues for 30 years at least. We need a theory, we need a hypothesis, we need ideas that actually illuminate, bring females to the fore as well as males. And that's really what I want to talk about. But now I'm going to show you what a cartoon to put in high relief what the contemporary view of sexual selection is. So I meant to read this, but it's too small on here. Just a minute. So he says, nice party, huh? Hi, yes it is. As a human female, I can, and so she says, as a human female, I can physically produce only one offspring a year, so it's to my genetic advantage to look for a reliable partner with whom to pair bond. So she's needy. He says, as a human male, I can produce many offspring, so it's in my genetic advantage to take any opportunity to procreate. Okay, he's indiscriminate, profligate. Given my huge physical investment in reproduction, I will not mate without first taking time to make sure that a potential partner has the ability and inclination to share in parenting. So she's choosy, discriminating, she's coy, not going to jump into bed. She's needy. I may as well spend the time acting as though I have the makings of a good parent, while for the time being really only looking for a fit, attractive female with whom to mate. So he's a cad, he loves them and leaves them, and it's all in their genes. So that is one of the modern conceptions of the differences between the sexes in what I call the first reproductive decisions, which are whom to mate with and whom not to mate with. Those are what I call first reproductive decisions. Who do you like, who do you don't like, who do you not like? So about this view is that it's highly stereotypical. Another thing about this view is it's highly intuitive, and as one of my colleagues, Judy Stamps, who's a professor at UC Davis, says, if it's intuitive, test it. And so as a scientific rule, perhaps that's one of the things that we should do, and I have spent my life testing these ideas. And I will mention to you that we know many species where females are the primary investor, where the males are choosy. We know, for instance, in chimpanzees, where females do most of the parental care, that those females are right ardent. They'll even mate with up to 8 males in a half hour. They're very demanding about sex. They're our closest relative. And they fit a parental investment pattern very similar to our own. And so that kind of ardent sexual behavior is not expected in those females. In other females, like the birds that I've studied for 30 years, the females, these are eastern bluebirds, will sometimes kill each other. They fight. Whatever they're fighting over, it's more important than whatever the males fight over. The males are weak fighters compared to the females because the males sit there and sing at each other, where the females are much more likely to lay beaks and hands on other females if they get to the point where they're actually fighting. So females fight, and males are choosy, and females are ardent. Individuals, if you just look at nature, are much more flexible in their first reproductive decisions than these generalizations from the last 30 years or 35 years from Darwin's observations would lead us to think. What I also want to talk about today is this new theory. I'm scared of using that word theory. Where are you? Yeah, there you are. But we have a new theory to explain sex role variation in individuals. I'm going to be talking about this theory the whole time. You don't have to memorize this slide. The important part to remember in this slide is that, can you see this even? You can't see it. Can you see this? Uh-huh. Okay. The idea here is that individuals live in constantly changing social demographic environments. And there are a couple of variables that very easily capture some of that demographic variation. Demographic variation and demographic stochasticity means some individuals die. Those potential mates aren't around. Encounter rates vary for a number of different reasons. Somebody might have a higher metabolic rate, or the wind might blow in a different direction. So 3 very simple variables tell you a lot about the likely mean number of mates in a lifetime. So these 3 variables are an encounter probability with potential mates. You don't have to memorize this. I'm going to show it to you later. The survival probability of the individual making the reproductive decision, and the latency. The latency is a period after mating when individuals are non-receptive. And that can tell you something about mean lifetime mating success. So you can imagine that if individuals know something about E, S, and L, that they can make a prediction about their mean lifetime mating success. That's pretty cool, because that they might be able to also observe other individuals in the population and some idea about what their mean lifetime mating success is. They may have the means for sensing the variance in fitness, and you might expect them to respond to that. In addition, individuals might be able to assess the likely fitness that would be conferred by alternative potential mates in the population. So imagine a female that lives in a population where there are 100 potential mates, and that she knows what the distribution of her fitness would be with that particular mate. We're imagining that individuals can actually predict that, so that's an empirical point to find out whether that's so. But if all of those things are the same, are true, then we would expect that where selection would act would be on the sensitivity of individuals to the inducing variables. That is E, S, L, N, and the W distribution. N is the population size. We would expect selection to act so that individuals really could assess the fitness background of potential, or the fitness outcomes of potential matings. And then we would expect the evolution of the means to respond to the assessments and to the sensitivities. And so this is an evolutionary idea. It's just not, it's both simpler and more complex than the previous ideas. Now, I want to talk about this in the relation, where's Ed?
He stepped out.
He stepped out. So this part is for Ed. One of Darwin's correspondents, somebody named D.B. Walsh, wrote to Darwin and said, and Darwin cited this person in this book, "It is astounding how many different organs are worked in by nature for the seemingly insignificant object of enabling the male to grasp the female firmly." Now, Darwin didn't want to talk about these organs. And I'm going to show you that he didn't. And I think this is fascinating that he didn't want to talk about them. So the first, I'm going to read you most of these things, so you don't have to read that text. So that's the definition of sexual selection. So here, when the male has found the female, he sometimes absolutely requires prehensile organs to hold her. Some animals, extremely low in the scale, have been modified for the same purpose. Thus, the males of certain parasitic worms, when fully grown, have the lower surface of the terminal part of their bodies roughened like a rasp, and with this they coil round and permanently hold the females. Now, that sounds miserable to me. Now, here's the first clue that Darwin didn't want to talk about it. It's footnote number 4, right after the part about the rasp that's coiled around the females and permanently holds the females. M. Perrier advances this case as one fatal to the belief in sexual selection, inasmuch as he supposes that I attribute all the differences between the sexes to sexual selection. In fact, what he was doing in all of these taxonomic chapters at the beginning is saying, here's a sexual dimorphism, but I'm not going to discuss it. So he does list these things, but Darwin does not think that these that these are necessarily explained by reproductive competition among males. He thinks that they could be explained by the fact that they might be essential for getting the males and females together. This distinguished naturalist, therefore, like so many other Frenchmen, has not taken the trouble to understand even the first principles of sexual selection. An English naturalist insists that the claspers of certain male animals could not have been developed through the choice of the female. Had I not met with this remark, I should not have thought it possible for anyone to have read this chapter and to have imagined that I maintain that the choice of the female had anything to do with the development of the prehensile organs in the males. He's putting female choice aside in terms of these prehensile organs. As you see, I have a lot to read to you. Whole chapters could be filled with the details of the differences between the sexes in their prehensile organs. As, however, these structures are not more interesting than others adapted for the ordinary purposes of life, I shall pass them over almost entirely, giving only a few instances under each class. Well, this is really strange to me. They're some of the most interesting organs you can imagine. I want you to pay attention to Darwin's language as he goes on to set these organs aside as not worthy of discussion in a book on sexual selection. Sorry, I have to make sure I get the right lines here. We have no reason to suppose contrivances by which the male holds the female and which are indispensable for the propagation of the species are independent of sexual selection and have been acquired through ordinary selection. So he's putting them aside as really only interesting about the normal propagation of species. Let me show you some of these. What? Oh, you want me to turn that towards me? Okay. So, he's talking about the higher crustaceans, and he says, in the higher crustaceans, the anterior legs are developed into chelae and pinchers. And I was thinking, well, that doesn't sound like the joy of sex. The sexes, however, the common shore crab, as Mr. Bate informs me, unite directly after the female has molted her hard shell, when she is so soft that she would be injured if seized by the strong pinchers of the male. And as she is caught and carried about by the male before molting, she could then be seized with impunity. Darwin's words. I mean, I think that he had the idea that this was... So in chapter 10, this is about insects. The insects are fascinating. One of the headings, diversified structures possessed by the males for seizing the females. The innumerable contrivances, therefore, by which the male is able to seize the female passed over. He really didn't want to talk about these. Besides the complex structures at the apex of the abdomen, which ought perhaps to be ranked as primary organs, it is astounding how many different organs are worked in by nature for the seemingly insignificant object of enabling the male to grasp the female firmly. So here, I want to show you some, I may have gotten ahead of myself, but I'm going to show you these now since I've already gotten to them. He's talking about the odonates. And these animals are really remarkable because the males clasp the females behind, they grasp the female's neck firmly. And they're highly diversified, and they're really interesting. And some of them on close view look hideous. To think that you would be grappled on the side by the head. Taxonomists love these things, of course, because they're so variable that taxonomists use the variation in the male claspers as a sign of, they assign individuals to species by the variation in these claspers. Now, on the web, you can see many pictures like this where people claim that these are dragonflies that are in copula. Are they damselflies? I've gotten it wrong. They're one or the other. And these animals are in tandem. They haven't copulated yet. Males will sometimes hold on for a very, very long time before they copulate. And when they copulate, it looks like this, which is very romantic. What's happening is the male has the female by the head. The female then draws her abdomen up to the male's thorax. So, here's how I do this. So right here, the male is extruding a spermatophore, which then it's quite extraordinary the way they do it. So then he says the mandibles or jaws. He's now talking, oh, wait a minute. I've gotten out of sync here. In male dragonflies, the appendages at the tip of the tail are modified in an almost infinite variety of curious patterns to enable them to embrace the neck of the female. Lastly, in the males of many insects, the legs are furnished with peculiar spines, knobs, or spurs. Darwin even knew about sepsid flies, and he didn't want to talk about them, which is just amazing. So these are some of the contrivances. I'm going to tell you about sepsids in a minute. These are some of the contrivances of beetles. And I was amazed to read in Darwin and then to find out that modern naturalists also know that those big claspers are sometimes modified antennas, and they are used for grasping females. Females are often much smaller. So nothing's more horrible in the world of animal sex than the sex of sepsid flies, if you ask me. Now, sepsid flies are being studied with a lot of interest because their sexual behavior is so horrible to think about for many of us. Even the photomicrographs are from my colleague in Singapore, Rudolf Meyer, and the forelegs of these flies are modified with these sharp hairs. And the males in different species use them in different ways, but the common usage is for the males. You can see this on YouTube, by the way. They put a male and a female in a petri dish, and then they film the mating. It takes no time before the male has mounted the female and hooked his wings and his forelegs over the wings of the female. So if you can see this, here's the male's foreleg over the female's wing. She can't fly. There's no way that this female can get away. And this is very common in the sepsids. And of course, the copulatory behavior is now being studied with a lot of interest by people who are interested in mechanisms of speciation. So there are three ways that sepsids do it. The most common way is where the male hooks his forelegs over the female's wings, but sometimes in some species, the males not only hook their forelegs over the wings of females, they also pierce the wings. I can't help but wonder what that does to females. I can't help but think it's not good for them. But there are three ways that sepsid flies of different species copulate. The one on top is the one that I've described. There are no preliminaries. He jumps on, hooks his forelegs over with these terrible spines, hooks them into her wings. I know I'm anthropomorphizing, but it sounds horrible to me to be hurt like that, and I think it's a legitimate question to ask. Are these females hurt by that? In this case, the male first tickles the abdomen of the female before climbing on, and he doesn't hook his forelimbs over the female's wings. And in this case, the male touches her abdomen or mounting. All of these are gentler. Darwin also talks about the devices in the vertebrates, particularly the fishes. The chimeroid fishes are provided with claspers that serve to retain the female. Besides the claspers, the males of many races have clusters of strong, sharp spines on their heads and several rows along the upper outer surface of their pectoral fins. And I was wondering what they were doing on the pectoral fins. We don't know. Very few matings of these kinds of organisms have been seen. I find these contrivances of males for seizing and holding females with impunity incredibly interesting. What a selection story might there be there? What's going on? What are the forces that favor the evolution of these contrivances of males for holding and seizing females. Now, one thing that Darwin did say is that he thought that they were absolutely required for copulation to occur. And one of my questions is, if there's a symmetric advantage, the same for females as in males, why don't we see the contrivances of females for holding and constraining males? And we see those much more rarely than we see the contrivances of males for seizing and holding females. This is an interesting problem. Now, I think if Darwin were alive today, he might be ready to discuss these things. We have a far more open society. You know, I dismiss that hypothesis every time I come to it. And the reason I do is that if you read the Orchid book, there's not a more salacious description of sex on the planet. And there he's talking about ménage à trois. It takes three. And so Darwin didn't have the Victorian sensitivity that would not allow him to talk about the details of sex. So in one way, I think, okay, maybe he was just being a Victorian. He didn't want to talk about it because he didn't want to offend someone. I wonder if that's the right explanation. I don't know. I wonder. I think it's worth finding out whether Darwin had similar concerns about all this sex that he was talking about or not talking about as he did about religion. At any rate, I've wondered where the monograph is on the diversification of contrivances for seizing and holding females. You all know that you can imagine that I am really taken with the lack of discussion. A couple of weeks ago, my sweet husband walked into the room and he said, "Long no more, my dear." He said, "I found it." And I was excited for a nanosecond and realized that he'd spent the afternoon composing a forgery. So I thanked him for the thought. His forgery got no further than the cover of the book, but he has helped me with expressing some of my own ideas in a stronger mathematical form. So where Darwin feared to tread, I would like to understand more about what these organs for seizing and holding females are about. So the new idea is that these male organs are organs that facilitate male control of female reproductive decisions. And it might work something like this. So imagine that he says yes or no, and he says the opposite. But this case, we're imagining that she says no and he says yes. We can imagine that some males are decent, kind gentlemen and walk away, and other males try to manipulate females into a situation where she says, "Okay, I'll do it with you." And so could it be that these organs somehow manipulate female reproductive decisions, and if so, how? So I thought about this in the context of what we've become more knowledgeable about in the last 15 years. In many non-human animals, females are able to kill sperm of some males at least. And we see that in a variety of organisms. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. If that's the case, then a male who would force copulate a female would only have his sperm killed. The real problem for a male is to get a female to use his sperm. Not just to get it in there, but to get her to use it. After all, if it's a species with internal fertilization, it's her ball court. You can imagine she has a huge advantage in what happens to that sperm. So if males successfully manipulate females somehow to say, "Oh yeah, well, I'll use it," they mate. And then they probably have a lot of work to do, because her resistance, if we think like a Darwinian, was probably associated with the fitness, costs, and benefits of mating with a particular male, and she may have had the prediction that her kids wouldn't have been as healthy. So I'm going to make that more concrete in a moment, but I needed to tell you a bit about, Darwin said that he did conclude about these contrivances that they made you think there was some difficulty in the act. And when I first read those words, I thought, could the difficulty be that females are going to kill his sperm? That's what I said as a modern reader. So it turns out that indeed there are many organs that females have for killing sperm. The one I like the most is in the ducks. Mallards are a species where forced copulation occurs. I became interested in the cloaca of female ducks and discovered when I read the old morphological tracts that in the second compartment of the cloaca where the sex where the sperm is deposited and where the female's ovarian tubes empty, that there are glands lining that second compartment, and they're identical in form to the glands in the gut, and they secrete hydrochloric acid. And I thought, now what would females have to digest in the second compartment of their cloaca? Sperm. It's likely that that's what they do. In this moth, there are many organs in insects that people call sperm storage organs, and some of them really are sperm storage organs. They're very long-term sperm storage organs because when sperm get in, they never get out. They're blind cul-de-sacs. So indeed, sperm storage organs, some of those sperm storage organs may also be, we don't know this as well yet, but they may also be organs for sorting out the sperm that a female has available to her. We need to pay more attention to the biology of females. So the killing time hypothesis says that males kill females' time, and this may convince her to use rather than kill the sperm. And this idea comes from the switch point theorem that embodies a new hypothesis for the determination of sex roles. I'm going to tell you a lot about this idea in a moment. What it says is that adaptively flexible individuals trade off time available for mating with the fitness benefits and costs of mating with this male or that male. So it's an idea that time's really important in anybody's reproductive career. I'll show you how that could be so. And if this idea is correct, individuals, not sexes, so now I'm making this prediction for all individuals, not sexes, should be flexible, changing their behavior to enhance their fitness, including their sex role behavior, moment to moment as they experience changes in their social and ecological environments. So in words, so this idea is an alternative to the idea that selection has resulted in genes for choosy males and genes for profligate males. It says instead, as I told you already, that selection has resulted in individuals with genes influencing their sensitivities to their environments and genes influencing their abilities to modify their behavior in contemporary time to enhance their fitness. Now, this is not a stretch. I mean, you live in a novel environment, namely where there are automobiles. You know, even 200 years ago, there weren't automobiles around, and yet we look both ways before we cross the street. We might imagine that animals can also modify their behavior in ways that would be very important to their fitness, including their reproductive decisions. The switch point theorem says that individuals adjust their behavior flexibly to enhance their fitness. So it's a Darwinian idea, but it's different from the classic ideas. It's not about what happens in this generation affecting that generation. One could look at the assumption that I'm making that all individuals are fixed for a flexible response, and that this being fixed for a flexible response might be a very, very ancient adaptation that we share with nematodes and flies and mice and ducks. It's also different from the classic ideas in that it's sex neutral. The classic idea that I showed you on those earlier slides begins with sex differences to predict additional sex differences. This one begins with individual differences to see if sex differences that we typically observe can be accounted for. So importantly, it predicts what individuals do, and it's based on time available for mating. Now, it predicts the effects of time on these reproductive decisions independent of female choice and male-male competition. Now, you can make a more complex model. You can put male-male competition and female choice into these models, but just take the simplest case where there is no typical sex division in reproductive decision making. And so I think it provides a basis for a new discipline on fitness and the ecology of sex roles. So now I'm going to show you how it works. You make some very simple assumptions. You imagine that individuals' reproductive careers are made up of only a couple of stages, one in which individuals are receptive and able and capable of mating when they might be searching for mates, and the time during which the time that they have to spend searching for mates may vary one individual from another. So that's the reason that the bars differ in length. You can imagine in the simplest model that they encounter a potential mate, they mate, and then they enter a period of non-receptivity. And after that, they're in latency. And they do this over and over until they die. And so now I'm going to show you a population of individuals. These are lifelines that differ among different individuals. So as you can see, the lines differ in length. That's because some of them live longer than others. So these are, each one is an individual, and some of them live longer than others. You can see that some individuals got to mate 3 times, others once, and others 2 times. You can easily see why this individual, the third individual, only got to mate once. They had to search a really long time. Maybe they didn't encounter anybody. Maybe they lived in a deep ocean environment. Maybe everybody else was knocked away by a hurricane. Who knows? In other cases, the latencies vary. So the period of non-receptivity varies. In all of these cases, I'm assuming that they mated when they encountered somebody. This makes the point that these very simple time parameters can, in fact, determine how many mates one has, or how many matings one has in one's life, or how many mates. So this is just reiterating that encounter rates determine how long an individual is in the period of receptivity. That's red. The white is the duration of non-receptive periods, and these determine the length of a latency, which is what we call it. And survival is indicated by the length of the line. Some individuals may be making these reproductive decisions under a threat of predation, and so their survival probability is much lower than individuals who mate in protected environments away from predators. Which reminds me that that tandem thing that the odonates do is really strange because, you know, 2 are a bigger signal for predators than 1. Those animals must be particularly vulnerable to predation when they're in tandem. And that's some prediction that somebody's probably already tested. My point is that whatever is going on in tandem might be important. We're going to add some complexity here. The E, L, and the S allow us to make some inferences in a group of animals that have that might all share a given E, L, and S, what the number of mates would be. A graph like this of the frequency distribution of number of mates is a graphical way for me to talk about the variance in fitness of a fitness correlate, namely the number of mates. And the variance in fitness, as all of you know who've taken an evolutionary biology class, is the variable that we're talking about in selection. We want to know how individuals vary in fitness in relation to particular traits. And that's usually what we see in these are sexually these are distributions of number of mates by sex. The blue one is a very, very, very typical distribution of number of mates that we see in flies when we look at them, and either Pseudoobscura or Melanogaster. And the top one is the distribution of number of mates for males. And what you see is that the males are more variable one to the other than the females are. All of that can be explained by chance rather than adaptation, but that distribution those types of distributions are commonly used to say that, well, the females are choosy and the males are indiscriminate and the males are competitive and the females like some males more than they like other males. And so those 2 distributions are used to claim adaptation. Well, it could be adaptation, could be, but it can equally as likely be due to stochastic effects, demographically stochastic effects. So that's interesting. Anyway, it's once you imagine that simple variables like an individual's encounter probability and their latency and their survival probability give them some information about their own likelihood of mating, it's not hard to imagine that they might not be able also to estimate the variance among fitness in the population. And that would be an important thing for an individual to know, because it's against that background that one has to make other reproductive decisions. So once you have that, if you also imagine that individuals might know something about the distribution of fitness that would be conferred in the population, this is new words I know, but simple concepts. So I want you to all imagine a matrix, males in the top, females along the rows, and imagine in all of those that we fill in all the cells. And what's in the cell is the fitness of every male mated to every female and every female mated to every male. And so our data for this distribution comes from that imagined matrix. We're imagining that individuals can predict and know what that matrix is, and then from that know something about the distribution of fitness. And I've put a milquetoast distribution of fitness in this graphic, but you can all imagine a distribution of fitness that's very right skewed. So imagine if I took this blue and moved it all over. Very few potential mates that would yield a low fitness, and most of the potential mates would yield a high fitness. Individuals ought to accept all those mates, right? That would be the expedient thing to do. The reason I'm emphasizing that is that this is something that biologists know almost nothing about. Truly. We haven't bothered to really measure this in a way that reflects the variation in the population, nor have we asked questions about adaptive behavior like reproductive decision making in the context of the distribution of fitnesses. This is work for the future. So I'm adding another rule here. If individuals are able to sense all these things, you might imagine that they wouldn't just accept, as I said in the earlier model. In this one, I add the complexity that they sometimes reject. And I'm suggesting that the variation in their behavior affects their fitness. That's a prediction of this model. So in this case, you see that sometimes individuals reject and sometimes they accept. So this is really, really very simple logic. However, with the benefit of the switch point theorem, it's highly quantitative. And I have to tell you, the fact that this theorem is so quantitative and gives us very precise predictions makes this idea vulnerable. And many people are confused when I say I'm so excited, it's so vulnerable. But that's what we do in science. We try to find out whether something's right. We're not just looking to confirm hypotheses. We want to know whether it's right. If it has a lot of predictions that are very precise and highly quantitative, that is our best option for finding out whether or not the idea really holds water. So I'm very excited about this theory. So for every individual, we can get a graph like this. This is a graph about an individual. And I'm going to tell you what it says. So on the x-axis is the switch point rule. And so here, all of the potential mates in the population, so for an individual like me, would rank potential mates from the best at 1 to the worst at 100. And this represents the switch point rule. F star is the best rule, the rule that maximizes lifetime reproductive success for an individual. And the rule is accept up to F star or reject after F star. This means that even if an individual encounters, say they encounter number 80 before they encounter number 8, doesn't matter the order in which they encounter them, they'll still be able to place them in either the accept or the reject category. The part that's really incredibly interesting is that the shape of the curve the height of the curve, the fitness associated with the curve, is determined by the E, F, and L, the W distribution. And so, I'll show you how that works. I've said that. So now I'm going to show you what happens. Imagine that from moment to moment that an individual's encounter probability changes. So as E increases, individuals reject more potential mates. So let me show you that again. Here, individuals accept most potential mates. Most of the mates fall on the origin side of the line, the switch point. The encounter rate increases. They reject more potential mates. It increases again. They reject even more potential mates. Finally, if it's very high, they reject even fewer mates, meaning they reject more potential mates. So that's a rule for an individual. We also wanted to know what would happen in a population of dynamically interacting individuals who experience different E, S, L, and N. And so we put these rules into a simulation model, and we then looked at what happened when males and females encountered each other. And there are 4 logical possibilities when both are making reproductive decisions. They can both like each other, AA, in which they mate and live happily ever after. They both dislike each other, so they both reject each other and they walk away and they don't interact. When it gets very interesting is when one rejects, the other accepts. So in this case where males reject and females accept, that's the case that I've been talking about during this talk, and I'm very interested in it. And one day when I was staring at a switch point graph, I realized that I had a potential explanation for why for the evolution of these contrivances of males for seizing and holding females. So I've drawn 2 graphs here. One is showing a female decision rule. They encounter each other, and her F star is way out at the decision rule above near 50. However, he's a 40, so she says, okay, I'll mate with him. The male decision rule is above 40 as well, and she's a 30, and he says, oh, yeah, I'll mate with him. So in these 2 decision rules, they like each other. Here's a case where they don't. Her decision rule is at about 73. He's an 80. She says no. His decision rule is out there at 95. She's a 10. He's saying yes, yes, yes. And so how can he change her mind? He can change her encounter probability. If they have not, if she's not been exposed to his sperm yet, you would expect that he would do everything he can to move her switch point out to higher and higher ranks so as to accommodate him. And so simply by holding on, simply by killing her time, he might move her switch point to higher and higher ranks. So I think that's just showing that again, the same sort of thing. So the origins of sexual conflict, I think, lie in this kind of encounter when individuals meet and she says no and he says yes. And when that happens, there's the possibility of sperm killing, and since that's a possibility, males have to convince females to use his sperm. And how do they do that? They can do it by just killing her time, which would, if the switch point theorem idea is correct, move her switch point to higher and higher ranks so that he is now acceptable. And if that manipulation is successful, then they mate and they do whatever they can to make healthy kids. Now, there are new quantitative predictions of the killing time hypothesis. No one's tested these yet, but they're pretty interesting because nobody's made these predictions before. The duration of pre-insemination holding on should be an inverse correlate with offspring viability. That is, the longer that males hold on to females before the female says yes, the lower the viability of their offspring should be. And a correlate of that prediction is that the number of their offspring to reach reproductive age should also be a negative function of the amount of time that a male holds on before she allows him to copulate. So there are differences and similarities between the classical ideas and the switch point ideas. I want to stress that both of these are evolutionary ideas. The switch point idea is entirely within the context of Darwinian explanations. I think Darwin would be very interested in this idea. Both of these ideas depend on past selection, but in one case the selection is associated with very ancient programs. I'm imagining that there's some program like Hox genes that may organize the sensitivities and assessments and the abilities of individuals to respond in these varying demographic and social environments. As I told you, the classic ideas say that depending on the patterns of parental investment, selection favored genes in one sex for one kind of decision and genes in the other sex for the other kind of decision. So the classic ideas predict sex-specific rigidity in sex role behavior, whereas the switch point theorem predicts that individuals of both sexes are flexible in their reproductive decision making and that both sexes make decisions that enhance their lifetime fitness depending on the amount of time they have for reproduction and mating. So the classic ideas start with sex differences to predict more sex differences. This idea starts with individual differences to see if sex differences emerge and in what kinds of environments sex differences would emerge. The switch point theorem predicts emergent sex-typical differences only when individuals experience sex differences in ecological, demographic, or social circumstances. Now that's food for thought. Let's see. I'm almost done. I think this new discipline that I hope for, the ecology of sex differences, could be partially based on testing of this idea. The switch point theorem really is a strong alternative hypothesis to parental investment theory. It's eminently testable, and some of you budding biologists out there might think about it. And so what's really needed now are strongly inferential experiments testing the alternative predictions of the two ideas. Personally, if I'm wrong, if we are wrong about this idea, I want to know soon, because I'm at the age when I know that life is finite, and I want to get on with this business of discovering something about the truth of nature. I see it as an approximate goal that we have here. That's what happens. We make approximate steps and towards the truth of nature. I'm pretty sure Darwin will like this. I wish he were alive so that I could tell him about it. Darwin still matters, and he matters a lot. Without Darwin, I would never have come to these ideas. And I can tell you, in my first year in graduate school, this was my Bible. I had a lot of fun reading it, particularly the second part that was about the animals that have taken up so much of my life as I've tried to understand them. Darwin taught me a lot. Thank you very much.
Again, I want to thank you all for coming on a Saturday and celebrating this occasion with us. I'm going to keep my comments relatively brief as an academic can make them. Relatively brief because I know you guys have questions you want to ask Professor Dr. Gowaty, and of course we want to get to the roundtable panel discussion. I'm going to start my response with a quote from The Origin of Species and just reflect on this concept of sexual selection and naturalistic explanations of complex behavior. It may be said, this is a quote from The Origin of Species, "It may be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working wherever and whenever opportunity offers, at the improvement of each organic being in relation to its organic and inorganic conditions of life. And that's from The Origin of Species. Now notice the words good and improvement in the quotes I just read. A lot of times students in my classes, we have these discussions, and oftentimes I find that they often think of evolution via natural selection as moving in a specific direction. In particular, that it's moving a species toward perfection. The word perfection comes up a lot, that it's all about improving, and going towards stuff that's good and avoiding the bad. And that comes up a lot. I think the use of the word good in the above quote sometimes, as well as the phrase survival of the fittest, can reinforce this concept. That, good in a moral sense or good in the sense of a perfecting sense. However, that's not necessarily the way evolution works. The examples in Dr. Gowaty's talk remind us that adaptation is not always good in the way that we like to use the word good, or even they're not bad either, in the moral sense. Instead, good can be interpreted, of course, to mean good in terms of reproductive success, usually by promoting survival and or successful mating, resulting in offspring, resulting in the passage of genes to the next generation. And then when you talk about sexual selection, oftentimes the physical and behavioral traits that arise via sexual selection, some of the ones we talked about today, they don't necessarily even, as Dr. Gowaty said, help the animal survive as do the naturally selective traits. In fact, I think you might have quoted Darwin, like he did not necessarily find those things interesting if they didn't help the organism survive. And what about evolution and behavior? I think sometimes things get more complicated in the minds of people as they think about these things. When you're investigating the evolutionary origins of animal behavior. Oftentimes, without a strong grasp of evolutionary theory, this often leads to sometimes misunderstandings and sometimes even controversy when evolutionary explanations of behavior are offered, especially if they're evolutionary explanations of behavior that people relate to human behavior. This misunderstanding could be even more pronounced when you're talking about sexual behavior, right? So when you see evolutionary explanations of, in particular, of what we see as deviant sexual behavior, like forced copulation or sexual conflict that we talked about today. When scientists produce naturalistic explanations for what people might see as deviant behavior like the sexual conflict or forced copulation, people might even use the word rape when they're thinking about it. This is often, erroneously I might add, used by people who want to link evolutionary theory to many of society's ills. Dr. Scott, remember earlier, for those of you who are here, showed us that evil tree. And how many of you guys were here and saw the evil tree? Yes, we all saw that evil tree. I've used that evil tree in my classes before. That evil tree where the trunk is evolutionary theory and its branches that grow out of the theory represents what the artist saw as society's ills, like war, genocide, racism, feminism, and one might add rape to that growing tree if someone takes that particular take on it. We heard yesterday about an old professor of Darwin, Adam Sedgwick, that I believe Ed Larson brought up, forgive me if I got that wrong, that after reading an advanced copy of The Origin of Species, he wrote a letter to Darwin warning him of the danger of breaking this link between the material and moral reality. Because in his opinion, if we did so, or if Darwin's idea would do so, then, quote, humanity, in my mind, would suffer a damage that might brutalize it, turn us into brutes, right? Brutalize it, and sink the human race into a lower grade of degradation than any into which it has fallen since its written records tells us of its history. Like Sedgwick, many times I read in the literature, or it comes up as a very serious concern of some students, many equate naturalistic explanations of human characteristics with a disconnection with our humanity, leaving us only our brutish nature. I've heard it many times. If evolution is true, then we are just animals. And subsequently, there's nothing to hold us back or stop us in our brutality. We turn on each other, and again, it would result in all those ills that we see on that evil tree, and it would lead to destruction. Now, I'll just be open, I don't buy that naturalistic explanations of human behavior leads to anarchy and immorality. Let's look at it empirically. There are many people who accept evolutionary theory. I don't see them raping and pillaging their way across the United States right now. I can guarantee you can walk in the halls of any evolutionary biology department. I can assure you that there is peace there. that they're not committing all types of atrocities. The idea, and then also, let's play around with this idea of humans being animals. As a biologist, I have to ask, what's wrong with that? We are biologically members of the animal kingdom, right? We're Homo sapiens. Thank goodness that we are biologically connected, because this allows us to learn more about ourselves by studying other animals, by performing experiments, by observing what's around us. We can learn about ourselves as well. We can learn about ourselves by studying other cellular organisms. We can learn about ourselves by studying atoms, by studying things at the quantum level. We're all made of matter. Our interconnectedness can also be very, very profound, and it can be very humbling as well. It highlights our responsibilities as stewards on this planet. It helps us to see and to feel our relationship to the planet and other living things on this planet in ways that we might not otherwise experience. However, we must be careful in how we apply evolutionary principles to complex animal behavior. Human behavior, or just animal behavior, is very complex, which we all know. We need to ask whether we can always reduce behavior and human characteristic down solely to a selfish gene, as we talked about yesterday. We also have to think about these misconceptions I mentioned earlier that sometimes people have, that these misconceptions that people have about evolution. This can help us choose our words more carefully in describing our findings so as to avoid further misunderstandings. It doesn't mean changing the data or hiding the data or not talking about our conclusions proudly, but just being aware sometimes of the misconceptions people have about evolution can help us be better communicators and better educators, which ultimately that's what we should do as scientists. And as Dr. Gowaty mentioned, we also need to be aware of how our biases might color our interpretations, what we bring into it. Misunderstandings of this, again, as I mentioned, often lead students to conclude that when scientists say natural selection might have caused an adaptation that results in increased success in, to use the example we talked about today in the sexual conflict or forced copulation, that somehow there's a value judgment being made. That if evolution is true, then we are just animals, then rape is okay. Sometimes I see people connect, or I read about people connecting the dots that day, or even that evolution causes rape. This is a giant leap of logic and is patently untrue. What does a credible naturalistic or credible evolutionary explanation for what we might term deviant behavior have to do with making a value judgment on what's right or wrong? Just because something can be explained in natural terms does not mean anything about it being morally right or not. However, even though we need to be very deliberate in how we communicate our findings, these evolutionary studies are so very important. They provide valuable insight that helps us understand other animals, helps us understand what's going on in nature, and helps us even understand ourselves. And in understanding ourselves, maybe we can figure out a way to maybe even change human behavior at times. These studies need to be done. They need to be analyzed, and they need to be communicated effectively to the general public. It also does prevent, as a professor, it also does prevent a fantastic opportunity to teach students about evolutionary theory if it's done correctly. And correcting these misconceptions, I use it as a teaching tool. You can teach them about sound evolutionary science, but the key is understanding where the starting point is. Additionally, as Dr. Gowaty mentioned, when dealing with sexual selection, we have to be vigilant in ensuring that our own biases do not color our interpretation of the data because of all that baggage that comes with society's view of gender and sex roles that we've already talked about. Dr. Gowaty has described evidence that, along with other studies that other people have done, challenge certain aspects of the modern, I was trying to use your words, the modern generalization of sexual selection as described by Darwin. Darwin stressing the idea about females being coy and choosy and playing a more passive role and mating rarely but in a very choosy fashion. Males being, I think the word was ardent, aggressive, promiscuous, just spreading their sperm all over the place because they don't have to put a lot of effort into taking care of the young, as well as the fact males duking it out amongst themselves. And again, oftentimes this is the case. But it's not always the case. Again, it raises the questions of how our observations, not just in this field, but in many different fields, scientists have to ask themselves about if our observations are being biased or colored by, are just being obscured by whatever biases we may have. And I forgot the name of your friend who said it, but Dr. Gowaty shared a quote. Judy Stamp. If it's intuitive, test it. And I think that's a great quote. If it's intuitive, if it seems, it's common sense, that should make something rise up in the breast of every scientist and say, ooh, if it's intuitive, I better test that. I don't want to assume anything. Being aware of these biases can open the door to new insights, new ways of thinking, like in this example about sex selection, for example, but it can be in any different field. About the power of female choice, male strategies of increasing the odds of passing their genes to the next generation. And again, just being aware as a scientist. You need to be aware of how maybe your way of thinking might obstruct or distort what's really going on. And how thinking about things differently can enhance our understanding. In my field, I'm a developmental biologist. I always use the example of fertilization, where sperm meets egg. For years, a lot of times the words that were used in textbooks and where it was this metaphor of the sperm, and you can see where this would come from, right? The sperm being a battering ram that buttresses and forces its way through the fragile cell membrane of this passive female egg, right? Very exciting language. I mean, wow. It's like a movie right there. However, if that maybe thinking of male as mastery and female as passive, maybe that might obscure understanding. And what they find is, it probably did somewhat. I mean, maybe what happens more likely is that the male sperm kind of docks on the plasma membrane of the female, and the female cell membrane comes up and actually engulfs. Talk about Freudian, right? The female membrane comes up and engulfs the sperm, bringing it into the cell, a very, very active process by both sperm and egg. So that's just an example in my field of how our particular biases might get in the way of our understanding. And finally, what Dr. Gowaty just talked about, and Dr. Scott also emphasized, is a perfect example of the power of science and the robustness of scientific theories and scientific ways of thinking. New evidence, or the same evidence looked at with new eyes, like Dr. Gowaty reading Darwin's words through modern eyes, or looking at contrivances, which people have known about for decades with new eyes, that looking at new evidence, new insights, that can cause us to modify or add to an existing theory. The modification of scientific theories, and hopefully we all seem to be repeating this. Obviously, it's important to all of us as scientists. The modification of scientific theories exemplify the strength of the scientific process. It does not represent a weakness. Our theories get better and better with more data. The more we modify, the more we make it stronger and stronger. With each experiment, the theory is tested. We want to find out if it is right. The theory of evolution has been and will continue to be modified as new data comes in. It is our best scientific explanation of biological diversity. It is the unifying theory of biology. It allows us to tie together all these seemingly separate facts, but make sense of them. We accept the theory of evolution because it works, plain and simple. The modifications that the theory of evolution has undergone has made it even stronger and has increased our understanding of the complexity of life on this planet, and it's going to continue to get stronger and stronger as more experiments are done and more data comes in. So let's take this opportunity now to ask a couple questions of Dr. Gowaty. Oh, no?
Yeah, actually, we need to take a break.
Oh, we're going to take a break.
Thank you both. Actually, we're going to take a 10-minute break and start our questions at 3 o'clock, so 10-minute break.